The iron was already glowing when they held her still. Not as punishment, not for a crime, but as a declaration. In the heart of ancient Athens, a city praised as the birthplace of reason and freedom, a child's body was turned into property with a mark that could never be erased. She did not cry out. Not because it didn't hurt, but because pain had already exhausted her. Around her, life continued. Merchants bargained. Citizens debated politics. Philosophers spoke of virtue beneath shaded colonnades. This was the Golden Age. And this moment was completely normal. History teaches us to admire Athens for its democracy, its art, its philosophy. But history rarely asks who paid the price for that brilliance. Because while marble temples rose toward the sky, thousands of women disappeared beneath the surface, their suffering absorbed into the foundations of a civilization that refused to see them. This is not a story of myth or legend. It is not about gods or heroes. It is about a system so carefully organized, so publicly accepted, that its victims were erased not by accident, but by design. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to the hidden sides of history, the stories that were buried on purpose, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to the History Veil, like the video, and share it with anyone who believes history should be told whole, not polished. Now let's continue. To understand how such a system could exist, we have to travel backward, to a time often celebrated as a triumph of justice. The 6th century BC. This was the age of reform. Athens was changing. Old systems of debt bondage among citizens were dismantled. Laws replaced blood feuds. Political participation expanded. For free Athenian men, this era represented balance, order, and fairness. It was the foundation of what would later be called democracy. But hidden inside these reforms was a contradiction so severe it would shape everything that followed. Freedom was carefully defined. And it was limited. The law decided who counted as fully human and who did not. Rights expanded inward, but beyond that boundary, absolute ownership remained untouched. Slavery was not weakened. It was refined. And among the enslaved, women were placed at the very bottom. Sexual slavery in Athens was not a side effect of poverty or war. It was a structured institution. Girls entered the system through 3 primary paths. Some were born into it, inheriting bondage the moment they took their first breath. Others were taken during wars, absorbed as spoils alongside gold and weapons. But the most common path was sailed by family members themselves, driven by hunger, debt, and desperation. The law did not forbid this. It normalized it. There was no minimum age. Records describe children being prepared before their bodies had fully developed. Youth was not protected. It was valued. Once purchased, these girls were processed through specialized workshops where human beings were examined like livestock. Bodies were inspected. Obedience was assessed. Value was assigned. Beauty determined placement. The most desirable were sent to elite environments where conversation and performance were required. Others were distributed to brothels near ports and markets. Those deemed undesirable were pushed into the lowest districts, where survival depended on volume rather than care. Every single one of them was marked. Branded with hot iron in places meant to remain visible. The scar served a purpose. It announced ownership. It erased identity. It told the city and the woman herself that escape was impossible. Under the law, these women were not considered persons. They were classified as andropoda, living tools. Property that walked. There was no legal concept of violation where they were concerned. Consent was irrelevant. Refusal was meaningless. Their bodies were defined as permanently available. To damage one without permission was a financial offense. To kill one was a matter of compensation. The law did not protect them because they were human. It protected them because they had market value. What makes this system even more disturbing is that the Athenian state did not merely tolerate it. It managed it. Brothels were licensed. Transactions were taxed. Officials were appointed to conduct inspections, not to ensure dignity or safety, but to maintain productivity. If a woman became ill, she was removed until she recovered or died. If she became pregnant, the problem was eliminated. If she aged out of profitability, she was sold downward, step by step, until she disappeared. Tax records reveal the scale. A significant portion of state revenue flowed directly from this trade. That money funded public buildings, festivals, theaters, and schools. It paid the wages of officials. It supported the very institutions where ideals of equality and virtue were debated. The paradox was complete. A society that praised reason depended on systematic dehumanization to function. And yet, this was not hidden in shadows. Brothels were placed deliberately. Many stood close to the agora, the political heart of the city. A citizen could debate policy, cast a vote, deliver a speech, and then walk a short distance to consume what the system offered. Politics ended. Consumption began. No secrecy was required. Participation carried no stigma. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable in a deeper way. Because this system did not survive through ignorance. It survived through acceptance. Artisans built its infrastructure. Physicians maintained its workforce. Priests sanctified rituals that blurred exploitation with worship. Officials recorded transactions with careful precision. Even philosophers, men whose names still shape our understanding of ethics, rarely challenged it. While lectures on virtue echoed through Athens, thousands of women lived without names, without protection, without futures. Most did not survive beyond their early 20s. Their bodies wore out. Their resistance faded. When they could no longer function, the system was already prepared to discard them. And still the city called itself free. This is only the beginning of the descent. Because as disturbing as this structure was, it did not remain confined to economics. It reached into religion, into ritual, into the very heart of what Athens claimed to worship. And in the next part, we will confront how violence was transformed into tradition, and how silence became sacred. Stay with this story. Because the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to look away. As the system expanded, it did not remain confined to streets and stone buildings. It seeped into something far more powerful than law or economics. It entered belief. Because when violence is normalized for long enough, it no longer needs chains to survive. It needs meaning. And Athens found a way to give it one. Each year, the city prepared for festivals that were meant to celebrate life itself. Fertility, renewal, divine favor. Music filled the streets. Wine flowed freely. Masks transformed ordinary citizens into symbols of joy and release. To the people of Athens, these days represented unity with the gods. But beneath the celebration lay a second reality, one spoken of only in fragments, preserved in careful silences. During these festivals, especially those dedicated to Dionysus, the boundaries that normally governed behavior were deliberately dissolved. Ecstasy was not an accident. It was the point. Order was suspended so the city could taste chaos without being consumed by it. And into that chaos, the bodies of enslaved women were placed as offerings. They were not invited. They were assigned. Ancient sources describe rituals where women bound to temples were compelled to participate under rigid control. Their presence was framed as sacred service. Their suffering was reinterpreted as devotion. What the city called communion with the divine, the victims experienced as enforced silence. 4 days at a time, Athens lived 2 lives simultaneously. On the surface, art reached its highest expression. Beneath it, exploitation was transformed into tradition. Citizens packed theaters to watch tragedies exploring justice, fate, and human dignity. They wept for fictional heroes. They debated moral questions inspired by the stage. And when the performances ended, they returned to a society that denied those very principles to thousands of real people. The contradiction was not hidden. It was ritualized. This is where the system reveals its true genius. By embedding exploitation into religion, Athens made it untouchable. To question it was not merely to challenge custom. It was to challenge the gods themselves. Violence was no longer just profitable. It was sacred. But ritual alone could not sustain a system of this scale. What kept it running was precision. Bureaucracy. Every aspect was measured, recorded, regulated. In the port districts alone, hundreds of officially registered establishments operated openly. Each paid licensing fees calibrated to their size and category. Every transaction generated revenue. Coins passed from hand to hand, then upward until they reached the state. The money funded everything the city celebrated about itself. Roads, buildings, public salaries, festivals, even education. Philosophers taught in spaces paid for, in part, by this trade. The irony was not lost on later historians. But at the time, it was accepted as practical necessity. Democracy required leisure. Leisure required labor. And some forms of labor were deemed too degrading for citizens to acknowledge. The system expanded outward, pulling nearly every profession into its orbit. Builders constructed and repaired facilities designed for repeated use. Metal workers forged restraints that prioritized durability over comfort. Physicians treated disease not to heal, but to return bodies to circulation as quickly as possible. Abortions were performed with crude methods that often ended lives prematurely. Death was considered an operational risk. No one involved saw themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as efficient. Placement within the city followed strict logic. The most expensive establishments clustered near centers of power, where elites could indulge discreetly. Mid-tier locations surrounded ports, capturing foreign wealth that would never circulate back home. The lowest tier was pushed into industrial districts, where exhaustion blurred the line between survival and collapse. Pricing was fixed. Negotiation was forbidden. The state controlled value. At the top, women trained in music, conversation, and performance were treated as luxury assets. Their nights cost the equivalent of several days' wages for a soldier. In the middle tier, access was priced like a respectable meal. At the bottom, bodies were rented for the cost of watered-down wine. And when usefulness faded, the final extraction began. Those who were sick, elderly, or visibly broken were sometimes offered freely, framed as a public service. A final return on bodies that no longer generated profit. It was not charity. It was disposal. Resistance was impossible. Refusal was punished publicly. Escape attempts were branded permanently, sometimes on the face, transforming identity into warning. Any act of self-defense could result in immediate execution without trial or record. The law functioned with terrifying clarity. Owners and clients were protected. The enslaved were managed. Yet within this brutality existed a twisted form of protection that exposed the system's true priorities. It was illegal to permanently damage property without consent. Illegal to kill without compensation. Illegal to steal or use without paying fees. In other words, the law shielded sexual slaves exactly as it shielded livestock or tools. Not because they were human but because they had value. All of this unfolded while the greatest minds of the age debated ethics nearby. Socrates spoke of virtue and self-examination, yet never publicly challenged the system. Plato imagined ideal societies while accepting slavery as necessary. Aristotle went further, arguing that some people were slaves by nature, destined for use. Sexual access, he claimed, was as natural as using tools to build. These ideas were not fringe opinions. They were foundational. They gave intellectual legitimacy to what the city already practiced. Philosophy did not restrain exploitation. It rationalized it. At the heart of this logic was a sharp division. Citizen women were guarded fiercely. Their purity was sacred. Laws imposed severe penalties on anyone who violated them. Their bodies mattered because they ensured legitimate bloodlines. Sexual slaves served the opposite function. Their availability absorbed desire that might otherwise threaten social order. Virtue was preserved by redirecting appetite downward. Desire itself was not condemned. It was managed. The result was a moral structure so stable it endured for generations. A city that prided itself on equality operated by excluding the majority of its population from humanity altogether. Participation was limited. Rights were conditional. Freedom was selective. Most women trapped in this system did not live long. Years of repeated violence, untreated disease, forced procedures, and psychological erosion took their toll. When bodies failed, minds followed. And when usefulness ended, disappearance was swift. There were no graves. No names. No mourning. Disposal was handled quietly, efficiently. Some bodies were thrown into deep pits outside the city alongside executed criminals and animal remains. Others were sold to medical schools, dissected in the name of knowledge. Even in death, service continued. And still the city flourished. This is the truth history often avoids. That the most admired civilizations are not built on abstract ideals alone. They are built on systems that decide whose suffering counts and whose does not. Athens did not fail because it misunderstood justice. It failed because it defined justice narrowly enough to ignore contradiction. And in the next part we will confront the final erasure. What happened when these women aged beyond usefulness? How their children were absorbed into the same machinery. And how a civilization ensured that none of this would survive in memory. Because forgetting was not accidental. It was the final stage of the system. When usefulness ended, Athens did not hesitate. The system had already planned for this moment. A woman who could no longer generate profit did not represent tragedy or failure. She represented inefficiency. And inefficiency was corrected, not mourned. As age hollowed bodies and illness dulled endurance, women were pushed downward through the lowest layers of the trade. From regulated spaces into hidden basements. From licensed establishments into illegal cellars. Their payment was no longer measured in coin alone. Food scraps, favors, or protection replaced money. Conditions deteriorated until survival itself became uncertain. For many, death arrived quietly and without record. For others, it came slowly, stretched across years of degradation that erased any remaining sense of self. Some survived into middle age, but survival did not mean escape. It meant exposure to new forms of cruelty. Later moral writers, centuries removed from Athens, preserved disturbing fragments of what occurred in these final spaces. Aging women, blind or diseased, were used as part of initiation rituals for young men. Others were offered at reduced prices as defective merchandise. Their humanity had already been stripped away. What remained was function without value. But even this was not the system's most efficient cruelty. That distinction belonged to what happened next. To the children. Birth did not interrupt the trade. It fed it. Women gave birth in the same rooms where they worked, sometimes between clients, sometimes alone. There were no celebrations. No names spoken aloud. Daughters were absorbed immediately into the machinery that had consumed their mothers. Sons were separated, sold, or assigned to labor. Childhood did not exist as a protected stage of life. It was merely the preface to use. In this way, the system reproduced itself endlessly. Bondage inherited before language. Identity replaced by price. A closed loop of exploitation so complete that freedom became unimaginable even as a concept. Athens justified all of this through moral division. Citizen women were sacred. Their bodies were protected fiercely because they guaranteed lineage. Laws imposed severe penalties on anyone who violated them. Sexual purity was not about dignity. It was about inheritance. Control ensured legitimacy. Sexual slaves existed to protect that system. Their availability redirected desire away from citizen households. Desire itself was never condemned. It was managed, redirected downward, absorbed by bodies that could not threaten bloodlines. This logic was not whispered. It was taught. Aristotle compared wives and sexual slaves to different kinds of tools. Both useful. Both necessary. But designed for separate functions. A wife produced harmony and heirs. A sexual slave satisfied need without consequence. Pleasure without responsibility. Use without obligation. These ideas did not emerge from cruelty alone. They emerged from convenience. From a society determined to preserve comfort without contradiction. And so, while philosophers debated the good life, thousands of lives were reduced to silence. While tragedies explored suffering on stage, real suffering unfolded beyond the walls. While citizens spoke endlessly of virtue, they defined it narrowly enough to exclude the majority of the city's population. Most women did not live beyond their mid-20s. Years of repeated violence, untreated disease, forced procedures, and psychological erosion took their toll. When bodies failed completely, disappearance followed. There were no funerals. No markers. No mourning families. Disposal was an administrative task. Many bodies were thrown into deep pits outside the city, mixed with executed criminals and animal remains. Others were sold to medical schools, dissected in the name of progress. Greek physicians believed the bodies of heavily used women provided better anatomical insight. Even in death, service continued. What remained after them was not memory. It was absence. Centuries later, when religious and political changes finally dismantled the system, nothing was built to commemorate those lost. The monuments remained. The Parthenon still stood, admired for its symmetry and beauty. The theater of Dionysus continued to be celebrated as the birthplace of drama. Few asked what had financed them. Fewer still asked who had been erased to make them possible. Even today, visitors walk among these ruins in awe. They photograph marble columns glowing in sunlight. They praise Greek philosophy as the foundation of Western thought. They speak of democracy as a triumph of human reason. And almost no one asks how much suffering was required to sustain it. This is the danger of selective memory. Civilizations are not judged only by what they create, but by what they require to survive. Athens did not collapse because it lacked wisdom. It collapsed because its moral contradictions became unsustainable. A society cannot permanently divide humanity without consequence. This story is not about ancient cruelty alone. It is about patterns. About how systems justify harm by redefining who counts. About how beauty can coexist with brutality when suffering is hidden or renamed. About how progress, when measured narrowly, can be built on silence. History often tells us that civilizations fall when their enemies grow strong. But more often they fall when they refuse to confront themselves. Athens was not destroyed by barbarians. It was undone by a structure that demanded the absolute unfreedom of many to preserve the freedom of a few. Where equality was celebrated in theory and denied in practice. Where humanity was reserved for those with power. They say history is written by the victors. But sometimes it is written by those who benefited most from forgetting. For more than 2,000 years, Athens has been remembered for its brilliance while its victims remained unnamed. Voices erased so others could echo through time. If this story unsettles you, it should. Because its purpose is not to condemn the past from a distance. It is to ask what we choose not to see today. How many achievements are built on suffering we ignore? How many comforts rely on systems we refuse to examine? How often beauty distracts us from cost? Only when buried truths are exposed can silence break. Only when erased lives are acknowledged can history become honest. And only by confronting the contradictions we inherit can we begin to understand what it truly means to be human. If you've stayed to the end, leave a comment saying remembered. Not as a gesture but as a promise. That some stories, once uncovered, will not be buried again.